Right. I think we're live. Are we good to go? Yeah. Brilliant. So thanks everyone for joining us today. We're going to be talking about Operation Drug Vote, which is a really exciting new campaign based in the UK. So I'm Hanna Head. I am a Ph.D. student at the University of Birmingham. I'm also a member of SSDP UK and the former co-chair of SSDP UK's University Drug Policy Committee. So just to kind of introduce the idea of what Operation Drugs Vote is, it's a voter education, registration and mobilisation campaign targeted at delivering drug policy reform in the UK. Operation Drugs Vote will lobby and build voter understanding and support for a cross-party or progressive alliance looking to deliver drug policy reform in the next general election, which is scheduled for 2024. Operation Drugs Vote will look to do this by bringing together different civil society groups in the UK, as well as with academics and drug user rights groups. It's the very early days of this at the moment, so this panel is actually still part of kind of shaping our thoughts around this, and so the ideas are kind of developing as we talk, so please do feel free to post comments and questions in the Crowdcast chat box. So I'm going to let each panel member introduce themselves, and then we're going to have a little presentation from each individual, and then we'll move into a panel discussion and Q&A. So to start off introductions, Giulia, did you want to go first?
Sure, thanks Hanna, thanks for inviting me. I'm Dr. Giulia Zampini, and I am Senior Lecturer in Criminology at the University of Greenwich in London. And I also fancy myself a drug policy reform advocate, and I am a drug user as well. And yeah, that's about what I'm going to say about myself. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Thank you for being here. Matt, did you want to do your intro?
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Matt Southwell. I was one of the first harm reduction workers in the UK, or one of the first generation of harm reduction workers in the UK. I came out as a drug user on a TV documentary in 1999, and I've since gone on to be working with a coalition of activists to build the drug user rights movement, starting in the UK, but then working internationally and now working in Europe. And I'm really excited to be working in this partnership.
Thank you so much for being here today, Matt. We're really excited to hear more from you. And then last but not least, Izzy.
Hi, I'm Isabella. I'm a politics and sociology student at UCL. I've been engaged in drug policy reform since 2017 following the drug-related death of my cousin, and I was part of the push for Melbourne's first drug consumption room. And then since then, I've been working with VaultFast, which is a drug kind of policy reform group based in the UK. And I also supported the release of the campaign for drug policy reform's official policy submissions to the Labour Party. I've been part of SSDP since 2020. I'm currently the secretary of SSDP UK and the incoming president of SSDP.
Thank you so much. And I hope everyone who's watching this can see we've got such a great wealth of experience here, and I'm really excited to hear more. So we're going to start off with Giulia giving us an overview of the kind of context of UK drug policy and just setting the scene for more discussions about the campaign.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, basically, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some work that I did with Professor Alex Stevens a few years ago. Starting with the concept that historian Virginia Berridge talked about, the medical penal framework as the main kind of way in which drug policy was made in England throughout the 20th century. Stevens and I have kind of come up with this idea of the drug policy constellation. And basically, we think that the most influential actors in English drug policy come together in this medical penal constellations. And this is where the aims and practices of public health and social control overlap. And it's important to note that constellations are not fixed. They're not fixed groups with fixed memberships. They're kind of fluid sets of actors that gravitate towards each other. And they have shared interests, they have shared norms, and they work together as a result. So there are different policy constellations in England, but the medical penal one is dominant. And the constellations, I would say, come together in response to specific policy issues. So, for example, the constellation around advocacy for overdose prevention sites is different from the constellation around, say, cannabis policy reform, although, of course, there is some overlap between the two. Now, I've got this messy diagram. As you can see, the diagram is really not my forte. And this is only a partial map of some of the drug policy players in England. So my question for today is, how do we move beyond the medical penal constellation in English drug policy? And I will quickly touch upon three main barriers. Now, the first one that I see as a barrier is a barrier to grassroots political reform, which is, I think, engendered by the way in which UK politics works. It is a very centralist structure. So it's kind of like the opposite of US federalism, for want of a better word. And in the US, there is a rich history of sort of using federal political legal structures to implement policy change. And this is often led by grassroots movements. Now, in the UK, this has been hampered. So I'd say the UK has a lot to learn from the US in this respect. But there are some infrastructural constraints. So, for example, the UK lacks the necessary structures that would enable this kind of deviation from policy norms at, say, local or regional levels. Recently, there's been an introduction of what's called the localism agenda. So, for example, policing and crime commissioners have been introduced, and policing and crime commissioners are elected officials. So this basically enables some kind of deviation from the center. So, for example, the Home Office. But this kind of deviance is not grassroots led, still remains pretty top down. Now, the second barrier that I see is to be able to enable the public to understand drug policy as a social justice issue. In England and the UK more generally, compared to the US again, race, for example, is not really an issue that has become embedded into Labour politics and left politics to the same extent. So political organizing, especially traditional political organizing, doesn't respond to intersectional politics in the same way, and doesn't focus on the race issue. So the dominant frame, I would say, in the UK and in England has always been class. Now, the problem with that at the moment is that there's been a massive resurgence of nationalism, and particularly ethno-nationalism in England and amongst the working class, which basically has been pushing the Labour Party towards waving the flag, towards being more nationalist and less interested in progressive politics. The third and final barrier that I'm going to focus on is the barrier to evidence-based drug policy. Now, evidence-based policy first kind of appeared as a beacon of hope, especially for advocates of drug policy reform. But I would say it has become weaponized, and it's been weaponized and capitalized upon to maintain the status quo, to maintain the medical penal constellation. So often evidence is cherry-picked to suit political interest. At the same time, we have many academic and advocacy kind of movements and arguments that are based on evidence. But these arguments tend to not appeal across the public. And this is because many members of the public find these arguments and ideas not accessible, not intelligible, kind of off-putting, because a bit too specialized, a bit too kind of expert-oriented. So the language may not be accessible. They just don't appeal. They don't communicate. They don't translate. The public needs to be informed, educated, and mobilized in ways that are not academic or evidence-based. And for this reason, I think Operation Drug Vote is promising. It tries to break through the mold, and it goes beyond the kind of more established mechanisms of evidence-based advocacy that I would say have characterized the UK drug policy reform debate for so long. And I'm going to let Matt talk about Operation Drug Vote. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Giulia. Matt, if you wanted to get your screen share ready. So we're really lucky to have Matt talking today. Matt is the convener of the group for Operation Drug Vote, so is the person who knows the most and has the most ideas about it. So I'll hand over to Matt now.
Look, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you, Giulia, for setting such a really clear and strategic backdrop to this campaign, which really makes my job much, much easier. So this is a campaign which has an ambitious goal. The UK has been going backwards around policy for the last 20 years. We've seen a decline of the British model, real challenges in sustaining the great success of the pioneering harm reduction model that the UK is so famed for. So when you hear us then coming to you and saying, well, we have a great idea, despite the last 20 years of losses, let's now secure drug policy reform by 2024, I think it's fair to say that this is possibly mission impossible. That's not my thing's not working. So let's look at the mission that we're setting ourselves. So the setting is, as we've said, the United Kingdom. The villain in this case is the Misuse of Drugs Act, 50 years of failure leading to counterproductive measures, setting back social justice, undermining racial justice, causing huge social problems that have particularly impacted on working class communities and communities that are poor and communities of colour, while wealthy people largely remain insulated from the full impacts of the war on drugs. Not surprising that this fits in with the Nixon strategy of using drug control as a tool of social control, particularly targeted at black people and poor people and any lefties that might be getting a bit too uppity. So the targets in this campaign are Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, known as Bojo to many of us, opposition leader Sir Keir Starmer, who is the new leader of the Labour Party. The key here is that we have three parties already signed up to this package of progressive drug policy reform. The Scottish National Party, the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party all support a package of enhanced harm reduction, full decriminalisation and legalisation of cannabis. The optimism of our strategy comes from that if one of the other parties decided to also back this package, we would have a coalition that could lead us towards a beginning of drug law reform in the UK with a commitment to go on to repeal the Misuse of Drugs Act. That's the goal that we've set ourselves. That's the mission that we're moving forward with. So look, as in all Mission Impossibles, there is someone who convenes the campaign. It's about bringing the team together. The mission can only be achieved when you have the full comprehensive team with a variety of skill sets working together to overcome the obstacle. But we have surveillance footage of the Operation Drugs Vote's convener from the BBC from 2001.
I was lucky enough to take ecstasy for the first time 12 years ago, and I've been taking it recreationally ever since. Turning on to ecstasy and club culture was also a turning point in my life. Now I'm part of an open and dynamic community that celebrates dance, music and partying. For most clubbers, ecstasy is an essential ingredient in this mix. It's helped increase my confidence and I generally feel happy with myself. This is probably hard for most people to accept. As someone who takes drugs, I'm not only seen as having a problem, but as being one too. By choosing to take ecstasy, I'm seen as collaborating with the drug's menace, causing the needless deaths of teenagers and contributing to the ever-rising rate of crime. However, I totally reject this. I care deeply about what happens to our society, and as a drug user, I'm sick of having my life attacked and being forced outside the law. So I've decided to speak out, show why drugs should be legalised and regulated. It's time to turn the spotlight on the politicians who, despite all the evidence, have refused to accept that the war on drugs has failed and in fact has done more harm than good.
So what happened next? Well, at the time, the impact was not transformational, but there were so many people ringing in mostly people who use drugs. After the programme itself, that the live chat was about to become a record for the BBC before we crashed the BBC website. In some of the follow-up press stories, senior members of the BBC themselves acknowledged that they had taken drugs, as one executive producer said to me, who I'd never met, even during the making of the programme. She said, given the fact that you'd all stepped up and shown such bravery, I couldn't not answer that question honestly when asked by the media. Sadly, the drug user rights movement was subsequently drawn into a very destructive engagement with our government, where we got caught in interdepartmental warfare and desires for us to be patient organisations when we were a united human rights movement. And since that time, we've seen the successive UK governments moving away from the famed British model, stepping back from harm reduction, promoting the completely baseless model of recovery, and increasing criminalisation. The results are self-evident and they're patently obvious. Treatment numbers are down, as is trust in drug services by people who use drugs. Drug deaths are at record highs. We have ridiculous contradictions where rich people can get cannabis on very expensive licenses, where poor people continue to be criminalised and denied access to medicine. At the same time, we've had, disgracefully in the UK, 30 years after our first HIV epidemic, a new HIV outbreak among people who inject drugs, linked to the injection of cocaine among street drug users in Glasgow. What a shame for a country once famed for its harm reduction approach. So, chatter in terms of observation of the drug policy movement has picked up that there's growing chatter about a new initiative. We are seeing drug user rights activists, drug policy advocates, academics and affected communities coming together. I think it's key to say that we don't want to step ahead of the alliance forming and to claim credit from and support from partners who are not yet fully signed up, because the model is not yet fully formed. But I think it's important to note that the first organisation to step up quickly has been SSDP UK. And I think this speaks to the youth agenda that is so central to Operation Drugs Vote. Labour is in a critical situation where, having moved to the centre ground, it is struggling to hold on to the youth vote. And our argument is that a drug policy campaign would engage the 50% of young people who are using drugs by the time they get to the age to vote. And this has been going on for generations in the UK. So we think there is a latent support that we can mobilise, but mobilise through young people. And that's why SSDP UK stepping up so early has been so important for this Operation Drugs Vote, and is key to us being here talking to you today. And it's also had, I hope, an impact on Operation Drugs Vote just becoming a little bit cooler. So, let me just take you through. Giulia's given us a bit of an understanding of the drug policy as it is now. Let me just set it in the context of our history. This is somewhat potted, I have to say. So 12,000 years ago, modern Homo sapiens arrived in Britain. One of the reasons Homo sapiens survived rather than other groups of early human beings is that they had a collective empathy. There was an ability to extend that not just to family groups but also to other Homo sapiens, and that became a key survival technique for early Homo sapiens. So, if we move, research by the British Museum and the University of York shows that the UK was engaged in a thriving international trade in opium as far back as 1650. In the period of the Iron Age, when ancient Celtic Britons lived in our shores, Druids brokered relationships between different tribes, and different hallucinogenic drugs, both cannabis and mushrooms, were part of the rituals of those early Britons. We then had three key invasions of our country, bringing in changes and also new culture. The Roman occupation led to warm baths and also the introduction of wine culture. The invasion of Germans from Anglo-Saxon countries led to large male genocide among the Celts, but also the introduction of beer culture. And then the arrival of the Vikings from Scandinavia led to a further introduction of another group of people also committed to drinking beer. So if we then look rolling forward to the period where the UK British people decided that actually we had had enough of our monarchy, and in 1649 we beheaded for treason King Charles I. In 1653, Oliver Cromwell was invited to become the Lord Protector of England. Sadly, he made a key mistake, which was to impose puritanical values alongside the new Republican model, and the abstinence from alcohol imposed by his monarchy saw only 7 years later the restoration of the monarchy. And I think there's a lesson about British values in there somewhere, and it's led to this key set of vibrant British youth cultures, each in their turn fueled by different substances. So let's now look specifically at this part of the campaign. We're not going to try and introduce the whole campaign to you because the long play is still really being worked on by partners. But I want to talk to you about the first part of the campaign that we're looking at. So the context for Operation Drugs Vote is that UK is a country that's been through bitter divides. Now, we have never been more divided as a country. That was driven by the very challenging discussions around Brexit. Our country has also been battered by COVID-19. We've had a government that has not taken public health advantage, leading us to have very, very high rates of infection running through our population. However, at the same time, our country is celebrating the community solidarity that has been shown during the pandemic and also valuing our public services. We know that we have ahead of us a double economic shock, Brexit and COVID, and we are in need of an economic boost. The Black Lives Matter movement around the world had a particular expression in a country that is so deeply bound in its history of slavery, and the toppling of the Colston slave trader in Bristol and the throwing him off his perch into the river was a key expression from young people and from the diverse community in the UK that we don't buy into this imperialistic sense of running our country, and we want to have a country that is much more truly founded on justice and social solidarity. There is also a concern that's grown over a number of different demonstrations in the UK during COVID about heavy-handed policing, and a lot of this goes back to drug control. We're also facing two political characters. The Conservative Party with a strong government majority linked to Brexit, but led by this very populist character who has turned disapproval with the old Conservative model into an argument for even more right-wing conservatism rather than actually trying to bring about real change. By contrast, there's been this strong, optimistic vote behind the new Labour Party leader, Sir Keir Starmer, who got strong backing after people were frustrated by a previous government's failure to put forward a credible portfolio. Sir Keir Starmer has been under pressure through to COVID. He has a very divided party, but he seeks to put forward a transformational agenda like the 1945 Labour government that introduced the health service, the National Health Service and the welfare state, following the experience of many people who've been through the World War and coming out the other side of the war with greater social solidarity and understanding. And there is a belief that from some of our academics that we may be about to go back into a period of a new roaring 20s where people are going to be embracing sexual freedom, the freedom to go out, the freedom to take drugs, the freedom to drink alcohol, to be with each other again. And the question is, does that become a point of conflict between the government and the people, or does it become a time of social transformation? So, we are, like in all good Mission Impossible campaigns, facing a first intervention, which is do or die. We get this right, and we have a pathway to a 2024 progressive electoral strategy. We don't have a pathway. So it's a do or die moment, and the key is that the Labour campaign for drug policy reform has put forward to Sir Keir Starmer a package that is of progressive harm reduction, full decriminalisation, and legalisation of cannabis. So that is something that over time he will make a decision about. If he makes the decision to join us, there is a chance to pursue this progressive alliance towards drug policy reform. So the campaign is based on this strategy that back in 1997, the new Labour government embraced this concept of cool Britannia. They tried to play on the cool social music, vibrant culture that is often linked with our youth cultures. But at the same time, denying drugs that was very much the thing that often put the cool in Britannia. He even used one of our dance anthems as the campaign message while going on to criminalise our community. So Keir Starmer has in front of him a platform that could create this progressive alliance. And the challenge... So if I could get Keir to sign up to this package, then there would also be the chance to then turn that pressure onto the Conservative Party and use it either as a chance to say, come and join us in a national coalition, or if they refuse to join us, to then deal with a full-on progressive challenge that would also highlight their lack of engagement with real racial justice, also challenge their commitment to social justice. And importantly, for progressives, there's a real fear that actually the Conservatives might legalise cannabis, and we would lose its transformational potential if they just took it off down a very commercial marketeering route. So the campaign that we are thinking about is this campaign called Cool Britannia. And it's a two-part campaign. In fact, the campaign is called I'm Cool Britannia. It's a two-part campaign. There's an internal Labour Party campaign. It would be a much more traditional campaign. SSDP UK critically reaching out to Young Labour, the Labour Party youth movement, hoping to get them to be first adopters of the Labour campaign for drug policy reform message, hopefully following the Danish youth Labour movement, who've also made a similar commitment to drug policy reform ahead of their government. So then we would do traditional work to work through the branches, build resolutions, have platforms of speakers, tools for speakers to take out to party branches, both virtually and in person, and build a momentum through to the Labour Party National Executive Committee. We would also create a campaigning environment through the Labour media, the Labour Party campaign groups, so that there would be a groundswell of support in the world of Labour to move this towards supporting the policy. And then alongside the campaign, there would be a social media campaign in the external world where we would use our networks as drug user rights organisations, harm reduction organisations, drug policy organisations, community organisations, to reach out to other people in our communities to stand up and say that we would back a progressive alliance if they all signed up to drug policy reform. And to the campaign, because if we're claiming Cool Britannia, I think we need to bring on board icons of Cool Britannia to also demonstrate their belief that this really is something that has widespread backing. And we know that there are many cultural icons who've tried to speak out, but every time they've spoken out, they've been criticised and hit back so heavily. But the key here will be to do it as part of a movement, so it's not an isolated attack or issue. And our campaign is to ask Keir Starmer to support the Labour Party Drug Policy Reform Group message by saying to him, I'm called Britannia, Keir, are you? And we would also then use the Labour Party campaign message, the music itself, as the backdrop to our campaign. Oh, fuck off. Sorry, fuck.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Matt. I think the Call Britannia thing is amazing. But I'm going to pass over to Izzy for her to just talk a little bit more about young people. Obviously, Matt, you've highlighted how important young people are in the Operation Drugs Vote campaign. So I'll let Izzy talk a little bit about young people now.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Giulia and Matt, for this presentation. It's super, super interesting. And unfortunately, I have no effects, but I can speak on behalf of SSDP UK in saying that we are so excited to be partnering with this. And not to be presumptuous, but we're kind of hoping that in your extended metaphor, we're going to become the Tom Cruise of it, but like we'll workshop that later, I guess. So I can't add on too much of a history of drug policy in the UK because I've only been alive for about 20 years of it. But I can offer some perspectives on the roles of young people in British politics. So to do that, I'm going to break it down into a few key time periods, starting off with a pre-2017 situation, a time before Trump, before people weren't sure whether Moonlight or was it La La Land ended up winning Best Picture, before Kendall Jenner thought she ended police brutality by handing protesters Pepsi cans. But across the pond, things were much more calm and kind of dull. Young people were incredibly and notoriously difficult to engage in politics before 2017. There was articles and reports and investigations into why aren't young people registering to vote and showing up in polling booths. And weirdly, no one kind of thought that maybe the fact that our Prime Minister Theresa May admitted that the naughtiest thing she'd ever done was running through wheat fields might have been part of it. I don't know. But we were disengaged and there was no kind of semblance of representation in Parliament, and it showed. In 2015, the voter turnout of young people aged 18 to 24 was 43%, compared with an overall turnout of 66%. So that's pretty abysmal considering we're supposed to be the kind of engaged demographic. And young people had always been majority Labour supporters, but the party really struggled to motivate them to register and vote until 2017, where under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, Labour experienced a surge of support from young people. And surge here might even be an understatement. They mobilised the 18 to 29 demographic like no party had ever done before, really. And it was because they kind of finally figured out that, shockingly, to attract young voters, you actually have to appeal to young voters. And Corbyn did exactly that. Labour promised policies for young people, informed by young people. He listened, and he kind of got through exactly what we wanted, which is better living wages, fee reduction, or even elimination at university, better job prospects after graduation, and more reaching for the stars, I know. And importantly, Labour also heavily used social media for their campaigning and optimised use of a new messaging and communication service. And this all really allowed young people to feel active in their campaigning, especially because it's to do with their own futures. And then at the 2017 election, again, it showed while the Conservatives still edged out Labour, 60% of 18 to 29-year-olds voted for Labour, compared with 27% for the Tories. So obviously a very decent gap there. But then following Labour's loss at that election, young people grew more and more disenfranchised, and they really started to lose that momentum that Corbyn had gained. After 2017 and heading into the 2019 elections, the gap between Labour and Tory support among young people remained kind of the same, about 30%. But the support for both parties ended up dropping. A large base of Labour's support, particularly among young people, ended up being transferred to the Lib Dems and the Greens, that are kind of emerging now as slightly more major parties. because they offered stronger environmental policies, higher education reform, even drug policies, and some concrete opinions on Brexit, which was definitely welcomed. Labour definitely lost the 2019 general election, but it would be unfair to attribute this to young people, but I guess it certainly contributed to it. Now in 2021, with the end of COVID restrictions in sight, fingers crossed, it's important now more than ever for both parties to be considering the youth vote and exactly how to win it. Our survey that we conducted in partnership with Neuroscience SSDP UK contains some really important information about significance here, including that 55% of university students surveyed across the UK had used drugs recreationally since September 2020 up till maybe around March 2021. And we can pretty safely assume that if they hadn't used it themselves, their friends had. So now coming into the next general elections, while it is a while away, Keir Starmer and Labour desperately need to win back the youth vote. But this time, they don't really need to try to sway Tory votes. They really need to get back those votes from the Lib Dems and the Greens and encourage voter mobilisation kind of equal to 2017 levels. And drug policy reform is absolutely an ideal way to get that. The Greens and the Lib Dems already support progressive drug policies, including decriminalisation and harm reduction. And Labour is beginning to look a bit archaic in this area. And it's safe to assume that if reformed, these policies would not only be safe for Labour, but advantageous in getting support from young people. And then backing drug policy, perhaps materialising in slightly different preferences, it would be ideal for the Conservatives as well, especially because young people are heading into a job market and an economy that is completely unprepared to accept us at the moment. And legalising cannabis would obviously be a surefire way to reduce those economic losses. And then equally important for both parties is buzz. We really need to bring that excitement, that registration, that mobilization back into politics, especially after a full year of nothing but COVID announcements, and then before that, nothing but Brexit. And drug policy reform, as we know, can really create and generate that excitement. So bringing us back to Operation Drugs Vote and the role of SSDP UK in that campaign. At the core of SSDP UK has always kind of been collaboration. Our connections are really wide and strong in the advocacy community, but probably more importantly, we can probably reach the widest amount of people through our networks of students across the UK. And funnily enough, those are the very same people that Labour Conservatives also desperately need to reach. So we're incredibly excited to kind of begin this campaign of education, registration, and mobilisation, and we believe that young people will be at the heart of that. And then that's all from me.
Thank you so much, Izzy. All of you were great. That was, honestly, I kind of zoned out and forgot that we were doing this and was just enjoying listening to you all. So we're going to move on to a little panel discussion now. But first of all, I'm just going to ask a techie question. Ev, I think you're still there. I can't see any of the questions on Crowdcast. Would you be able to let me know if there are any?
Yes, let me double check.
I've posted in the Zoom chat, but yeah. Moving on from that, so let's get into a bit of a panel discussion. So if the three of you want to discuss anything that you kind of talked about, was there any key points that stood out, maybe from Matt's presentation, that either of you wanted to bring up, or I can just ask you some questions?
I was just struck by Izzy's perfect analysis about the need to engage youth in politics, and I guess I'm disheartened that the Labour Party doesn't see that in the immediate term and is focusing instead on attempting to regain the vote of older people who are, let's face it, a lot of them are going to be on their way out soon. So although in the immediate term, I understand their concern, but in the long term, that's not going to be at all useful to them, as well as putting us in a dire situation, a dire political situation. So just reflecting back really about how much we need this. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think following their really kind of devastating losses of their most recent election, I think that they're incredibly concerned to be making those kind of long-term policies, which is obviously upsetting because they're the ones that are going to have the most impact by far. And obviously we can empathize with that and understand that they want to try to win back those votes quickly. But yeah, like you said, it's going to be the younger generation that'll do it, if any. And if we kind of get that level of 2017 support, it could be a nice and easy transition for Labour, but they just haven't started to embrace it yet, which is so frustrating.
They're just so focused on short-term cycles, and that's again a problematic for the way in which the political system and structure is set up. It's about the next election, and don't know. To me, it just sounds like some wrong strategy. And I don't know. Like I'm wondering whether and to what extent, young Labour can sort of like, have any sway in this. Because I was seeing that in New Zealand, they came out strongly in favor of decriminalisation, which is lovely. And I just think we need more of that.
Brilliant, thanks guys. So we've got our first question coming through. So I'm just gonna read it out for you guys. So how do you get young people excited to vote who are otherwise disillusioned with the electoral process?
I think, at least from my perspective, it's kind of realizing what young people want. It's very kind of easy to be doing that, but it seems the politicians are continuously stuck in that. Like, we kind of see a few different politicians emerging that like have a handle on social media and like know the ways to be campaigning, which is not through like slanderous TV ads, because none of us are watching TV anymore. So it's like really kind of picking and choosing what to be doing. And I think that social media campaigning is a great way to do it, but then also kind of directly interrelating it with like young people's interests. We want these reforms for our benefit. It's not for this anonymous group of drug users that we're not aware of. Like everyone knows a drug user or is a drug user, or everyone can benefit from a better economy. Everyone can benefit from all of these kinds of reforms, or even just a stronger public health approach. So I think it's about kind of making that effort and directly appealing to them, instead of having them as a background idea that might be like a bit complementary to your campaigning, but not at the core of it, I guess.
I think that my experience of lecturing and seeing lots of young people come through the doors of university being very disillusioned with politics, because politics has done nothing for them for such a long time. And I'm also thinking about the kind of loss of kind of mass political organizing as something that has been happening, over the course of a few decades, and the impact that it's had on, allowing people to feel like they belong to a group and they're part of a unit that have shared interests, like students wouldn't be, like laborers might be, in whatever way. It's about kind of sending that message. You belong to a group, you have common interests, therefore you have to stand up for your rights, for your interests, for what you see as benefiting your group in the short and long term. And I see a lot of students coming through the doors being really disillusioned and having a very, very individualistic outlook that doesn't allow them to see themselves as part of a group, as part of a critical mass. So I think, I don't know, maybe we need some kind of like return to that understanding of community and communal shared interest and belonging somehow. Yeah.
No, look, I really agree. And as one of a generation of a sort of campaigning group of students that in our country were campaigning against Margaret Thatcher and campaigning against the introduction of student grants, fighting against apartheid, a whole series of issues that we were campaigning around, as well as supporting people in the mining industries and other industries that were struggling at that time. So for me, I don't think there's been a loss of capacity among young people. I think there's been a lot of a focus and a loss of honesty from politicians to engage young people. There's so much spin and playing issues around. I think we need to talk honestly about drug policy. It's not going to be easy to do what we do next, but at least let's have an honest conversation about it. Let's make sure that those communities that are struggling from open drug scenes get support to manage those problems and regenerate their communities. Let's make sure that communities that have traditionally been disadvantaged by drug policy have a leg up in them to what comes next, so they have jobs, they have training to go on into that industry, so we don't see like a North Sea oil situation where all the resources of our country are taken by a very small group of people for a very small amount of time. The benefits of drug policy, and particularly legalisation of cannabis, becomes part of introducing racial justice and social transformation in our society. That's a 1945 agenda, and I think if we can get Labour to see that, and I think the best way to do that is through the voices of young people within their movement, backed up by an external community. I think that could be transformational. But we have to demonstrate to Labour that it could have that impact, and that's why this first campaign is so critical.
Brilliant. We've had a few questions coming in. There's one that's specifically about Operation Drug Vote, so I'm going to start with that one. So how important is civil society coalition building to the success of this campaign?
Yeah, look, I think it's key. I mean, I'm really heartened by the range of academic, drug user rights, and drug policy partners, who are international, national, and regional specialists all coming together. The UK has a very rich tradition of drug policy actors. There's clearly no lack of technical expertise to deliver drug policy reform in the UK. There's just an absence of political will, and that's what the campaign is trying to shift.
Yeah, and I think that also most of the civil society organisations in the UK have been putting out such fantastic campaigns, but a lot of the time it's hyper-individualised, and to kind of get that collective voice, so to kind of package it up as easy as possible for politicians, like really kind of step it out for them. We're not asking you to concentrate on several different campaigns running at any given moment. We're asking for your attention on this one thing. And I think that kind of like centralized and concentrated effort is something a bit unprecedented, at least from my understanding in this area. So I think that that'll be, really, really important and key to the campaign.
Brilliant. So another question that's come in is, young people have more political power than ever in the UK. Do we anticipate pushback from the Conservatives trying to undermine youth priorities as part of this?
Yeah, look, I mean, from my point of view, as a Labour Party, someone who's recently joined the Labour Party, back again, I left when New Labour really shafted our community, and after we had been part of the public health response, they then abandoned us. But I've come back to the Labour Party because I want to see change take place, and I think now's the time to really mobilise, in a defined way to bring about change.
I think it's also a matter of framing, like with the Labour Party, they're always going to be more receptive to the kind of youth voice, and it's precedented and it's familiar and comfortable for them. So obviously I think with the Conservatives, that's not going to be our primary campaigning strategy. They've never relied on the youth. They've never had to rely on the youth. So framing it in just different, we've got a million lenses through which we can look at drug policy reform and the benefits of that. So I think it's just about picking and choosing exactly what's going to be right for each party.
Sorry. I was just going to say quickly that, you also need to look beyond the Conservative and Labour Party as a unit, because within those parties, there are people with various different tendencies and inclinations and kind of beliefs around, some members of the Labour Party are really socially conservative, and some members of the Conservative Party are really libertarian. And so it's about building those cross-party coalitions as well, because I think some members of the Conservative Party are more interested in youth. Maybe they are younger themselves. Maybe they have a better understanding. They're not so disconnected and kind of, unable to relate. So it's also about understanding who your allies are within both parties and who you can work with.
Yeah, sorry, the point I was trying to make before I forgot what I was talking about was that I think the Progressive Alliance is the most logical pathway. For me, as a Labour Party supporter, that's on some levels I'm biased around that. The back I get is the Conservative Party have financial backers that are deeply invested in prohibition in a number of different ways, both in the illicit and the legal markets, and that's a real barrier to change for anything really other than cannabis legalisation. So I think, for me, as a left winger, that's how I see the situation. However, I think very importantly, we have people involved in the Conservative campaign for drug policy reform, and they will be running a campaign to persuade the Conservative Party that this will be a moment to come on board. And that's an equally important part of this campaign. I think for the credibility of a progressive campaign, we actually need to put a fair and genuine invitation to the Conservative Party. So if they then turn it down, then we can turn the guns of a progressive campaign on them full blast.
It's so difficult because I don't want to interrupt you, but we're getting more and more questions coming in and we don't have that much longer left. So I'm going to do kind of quick fire. I'm going to ask a question and then let you all kind of have 1 minute or a sentence to answer. So the first one we've got is, do you think young people are now more compelled to act on drug policy when it's positioned as an issue of individual freedom or a larger social issue, such as the health and well-being of people who are being marginalised for their drug use? And how can we ensure that those marginalised voices are included in our policy reform efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen a really interesting interlinking, like with the protests in America, for example, where a lot of those kind of horrific acts have been perpetrated against drug users, and they've been perpetrated like in the sake of the stop and search or something like that, and it's never been like it's never been disjointed. It's always been a harmonious effort, and I think that now there's probably a bit more popular conscience about that than ever before, and I've certainly seen a lot more discourse about it on Twitter, whether that's an echo chamber or not, it is. But yeah, I think there's a lot more awareness about that, and I hope that will continue, because the question is exactly right, and we need to continue to engage marginalized individuals. Young BAME men are always consistently ranking at the highest number of drug arrests, and there's just so many reasons to kind of be engaging with that.
Giulia, did you have anything you wanted to add?
One sentence, one quick. Individualism and intersectionality are linked. So there is a paradigm shift now in the way that young people, especially, conceive of politics and themselves. And so I think drug policy reform and social justice are linked by way of thinking that is becoming dominant. Yeah, so at least that's my hope.
Fab. Next question. I've just scrolled. Oh no, where's it gone? Oh dear. How does drug policy reform impact drug users in the UK, especially in regards to their human rights? I don't know if anyone has something to answer to that one.
Yeah, I think the impacts are there's 90% of people who use drugs who use them experimentally or recreationally or in a controlled manner, and most of that group will be able to hide themselves from the law. A small number will have legal problems. I think the journey with ecstasy is a very good example of what prohibition does. My generation of ecstasy users were using the organic saffron-based MDMA. And then over successive interventions by banned precursors, we've ended up with more and more troublesome precursors, so that ecstasy deaths are getting more and more and more increased. Had we just stayed with and regulated and controlled the original ecstasy version with its organic base, we wouldn't have any of the deaths that we're now seeing. So that is replicated with multiple drugs. It also impacts on people's self-identity and sense of self-worth, and it brings shame into our drug taking, which undermines our drug use, and it takes away the pleasure paradigm, which is such a critical part of positive drug taking.
Thanks, Matt. That was a really great answer. Izzy or Giulia, did you have anything you wanted to add, or shall I move to the next question?
Next question, I think.
Okay, brilliant. Sorry to say the C word, but the question is there any impact of COVID-19 on civil society's participation in this campaign?
I mean, if anything, from my experience, COVID-19 has afforded a completely new opportunity to connect over distance that wasn't there before. So I personally met most you and just more people through the pandemic, and it's this ability to connect over distance. You don't need to rely on geographical proximity and meeting in the same physical place to be able to work together. And so actually I see it as an opportunity.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's really hard for me trying to chair this and also wanting to answer, but I feel like everyone has kind of more time for online meetings, and we've managed to connect a lot more than we might have previously done, which has been unexpected positive. So we've got two questions that are specifically talking about global networks like SSDP international, but I'm not 100% sure that anyone in our group is going to be able to answer them. Me and Izzy are both quite new to SSDP UK. So Jason, I'm going to skip those, but we'll happily have a chat with you about that. But we wouldn't be able to answer them. And we're very much at the end of our session. So I'm going to end on a hopeful note and ask you all to just summarise what your hopes are for the Operation Drug Vote campaign in the future.
I'll go first. I think we are making this opening play of the I'm Called Britannia campaign, and I think, like any campaign, like any social media campaign, you're trying to capture people, and I think there is key opportunity right now with people more engaged in communication tools. I think if we can do that in a really smart way and gather around us designers and people with technical skills who can really embrace this Called Britannia culture and values, then my hope is that some momentum will build behind the campaign. And when momentum builds, wonderful things happen. You don't always not know what they're going to be, but we're a very vibrant and dynamic community, and that's what I think. That's where my hope in this campaign is founded.
I think for me, if nothing else, it's kind of getting this into a more mainstream context, especially among young people, and having this something that is spoken about, even if we don't get the kind of political reform that we're after. This kind of, the impact of just having these conversations is going to last beyond this next election, and it's going to continue to be like on the menu, which is, I guess my greatest hope, just that this is spoken about a lot more by circles other than our own.
Yeah, for the longest time, drug policy reform hasn't been a political priority, and there is just very little understanding about the centrality of drug policy for social justice. And I think that, if nothing else, it's about spreading that message and about kind of centering that as something that more people understand, that more people care about. That's it.
Brilliant. Thank you all so much. I think that's all we've got time for. But thank you all for joining me, and I hope everybody who's been watching has enjoyed. If you want to know more about what we're doing at SSDP UK or talk more about Operation Drug Vote, please feel free to get in touch. I think Giulia is also posting in the chat saying she's happy to chat more about the questions around global networks, so please do feel free to get in touch. But I think that's us done. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the conference.